Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun to be at a conference with a very different kind of audience and very different kind of presenters. So my background is in sociolinguistics and in natural language processing, and I've done a lot of work on speech recognition. And so the talks that I go to are either very technical or they are very sort of linguistics-y. So it's very fun to be in a space with lots of actual historians and actual philosophers. So I'll be talking about this idea of algorithmic language management, which has sort of been in the background of a lot of my work over the last couple of years, and hopefully soon in the foreground of some of the work that will hopefully be published this year. And I think overall, I'm going to present more questions than answers. I hate to say it. Specifically, I am sort of looking at this question of how what we know about language and power and the study of language and power and identity in the field of sociolinguistics can help us to understand how AI, as both material and sort of political objects, affects how we think about language and how we think about people, and also how we use language, and how technologies are sort of being used to exploit, in particular, people who do linguistic work. And I wanted to also bring up this idea of embodiment, because this is one of the ideas that has sort of been coming up over the last 2 days, and it's something that's really central to my interest in AI as well, because from the sociolinguistic perspective, we're always really interested in who you are as a person, both sort of in a social sense, but also sort of how your body is and who you are in the world, how that shapes your linguistic behavior and sort of your linguistic and social identity. And so this question of what happens when we take away this embodiment is really, really interesting to me. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about I'm going to bring in these 3 contexts. So the first one, I think, is familiar to all of us, so I will skip this, not talk very much about algorithmic management and surveillance, but this is sort of, consider this to be in the background looming, and I'll draw on this a bit more. But more specifically, I'm talking about the work that has been done on the commodification of language and language work, and those kinds of concepts. And I will also be drawing on language policy and language planning, which has to do with the standardization of languages, which I think figures in understanding what language technologies are doing today. So this idea of the commodification of language or language varieties has become a really popular frame to discuss how differences in status between different languages, sort of the different social meanings that different language varieties index, how those differences can be used to extract a profit. So, for instance, a standard prestige language variety might be more valuable in particular contexts because it signals expertise, or it signals a particular sort of closeness to the state or to whiteness or to whatever ideal you're looking for. And conversely, sometimes otherwise non-prestigious varieties can have a sort of covert prestige. So in the context of tourism, for instance, it might signal authenticity, even though otherwise it's a sort of non-standard dialect. How we conceptualize language in this context is a bit debatable. Broadly, I think it's probably better to think of it as a resource than a commodity. But setting this entire debate aside, what's core here is that these linguistic skills and behaviors are being commodified and are being really central to this work that people undertake, especially in the context of, for instance, call centers, of classrooms, of offices, anywhere where language is really the core, sort of the core work that is being done, the core activity. And workers in these contexts are really incentivized to further develop these skills as well. So just to give a little bit of background of what I mean here, in the context of technology, there's obviously long been a history of these language workers, if you will. So these have been, for instance, switchboard operators who both have a lot of technical skills, because operating switchboards is really difficult, but also a very particular identity. And this is what I mean by the embodiment. So it's not just about doing the actual mechanical movements, but it's also about performing a particular kind of identity. So the people who were hired to be switchboard operators historically have largely been unmarried white middle-class women in a lot of different contexts around the world. And today, the paradigmatic sort of modern examples are maybe call centers, especially in the global south. So these are outsourced call centers from companies that are based in the global north, but if you make a call to their customer service, you will be talking to a person who sits maybe in India and who's speaking to you maybe in a US or British standard accent, which is something that they're explicitly taught at their workplace because they are projecting a different kind of identity to the one that they've got. And so this is of particular interest to sociolinguists because it's so extremely obvious, this sort of hierarchizing of different varieties and different kinds of workers and different kinds of people that usually is quite hidden, is really obvious in call centers. And it raises these, interesting questions about the connection to embodiment. Quickly on language policy and planning. So language policy and planning is a sort of field within sociolinguistics or the sociology of language, depending on how you look at it, that really emerged in the 1960s. And Thomas Regento, in his history of this field, identifies the sort of formal decolonization that was going on at the time, structuralism and a sort of pragmatism as sort of the core drivers that really pushed that field in such a way that the linguists sort of became these technical experts that would come in and sort of fix or formalize a really messy linguistic situation. So if you have a context where there was lots of different linguistic groups and maybe lots of different ethnic groups, and no longer the colonial language as the sort of high status variety, you needed to somehow fix that problem of sort of multilingualism, in very big scare quotes. But the idea was, you need a homogeneous sort of one nation, one language kind of idea to be able to solve any problems within your nation. What actually happened most of the time is something that is called stable diglossia, where essentially the colonial language stayed in power for all sort of high domains, government, education, etc., and the local languages became standardized by external experts, often in ways that were very contested, often in ways that were maybe not ideal, and have sort of since been sort of turned into these standard varieties. And the reason I bring this up is because we still see this kind of language planning. So today we might not be seeing this kind of overt sort of paternalistic Western language planning on the level of the state, but we do still see it in, say, language technology design, where you do need to make all kinds of decisions when you're designing a language technology system about how a language is formalized, how it is selected, how it is standardized, which languages you pick, etc., etc. And it's unsurprising that the languages that are being prioritized are the high-resource standard languages of the West. That is because, the very design features of the underlying technology requires it to be high-resource, and for historical and ideological reasons, there are only certain languages that are, in fact, high-resource. So we still see this echo, basically. So those are the two big ideas or big contexts that I wanted to bring in. And moving on now to this idea of language management. So this is specifically drawing on Bernard Spolsky, who was a sociolinguist who's done a lot of work around language policy in different contexts. And he formalized this idea of language policy as comprising language practice, beliefs, and managements, where practice is sort of like what kind of variety we choose. Like in this room, we decide that we choose English as our sort of common lingua franca for academic communication. The language beliefs, so perhaps there are underlying beliefs around what language is appropriate for this kind of thing. It might not just be which language, but also maybe which language variety. So it's maybe standard English rather than another type of English. And then language management is any kinds of rules that we have in place that could modify either of these things. So we could write a policy to be like, no, actually, we will speak Italian in this room. And yeah, so language technologies, I think, are this really interesting case of language management because on the one hand, they reflect all of this context, but they also do the language management bit where they nudge you, they push and pull you in particular directions in terms of what kind of language you can use, and then the way that we talk about them, and then the way that they present language, they also obviously shape the way that we think about language in a more abstract sense. And this also connects to the sort of broader idea of algorithmic management. And the sort of core examples that I want to give now in the second half of the talk are around the ways that this is used to manage workers. So for instance, we have the sort of classic examples of workplace surveillance, sort of scheduling of different workers, and also assessment of their performance. And those are not just performed by AI, broadly speaking, but they are performed specifically by technologies that are about processing language and then doing all kinds of things very specifically with language, not just with other kinds of data. And this is sort of the broader management of behavior, including linguistic work and the management of beliefs. So one of the sort of recurring themes in all of the discourse around these technologies, for instance, in marketing, are around language as this barrier that needs to be broken. Language is some kind of friction between different people. Language is also as markets. So once you get into a particular language, you're also accessing a particular market. And at the same time, workers are sort of framed as these, on the one hand, as machines, but on the other hand, also as these empowered entrepreneurs that are both automatable and autonomous. And there's this interesting sort of tension that is maybe signaling to managers and workers at the same time, trying to do everything at once, be everything to all people, So to make this more concrete, I'm going to look at some examples. This is a company that I've been really obsessed with recently, called Cogito. So they are one of many companies that specifically provide software to monitor and sort of manage call centers and call center workers. So in this case, you have this really interesting personalization, right? So we see this woman who's the paradigmatic worker. Her name is Alice, so we're already personalizing her, and she also gets some, personalized guidance and some feedback. But also she's sort of framed as this entrepreneur because, like, in her break, it's not a training break, it's not mandatory training or anything like that, it's upskilling. So she's further developing her skills, her personal skills, and then she's meeting some goals with the rest of her team, right? These are also always referred to as agents, which I think is an interesting thing, put a pin in that. And then we can look at what these companies actually do. So this is the part where it tells us about the software. And it has these two big things that it does. On the one hand, it looks at strengthening relationships, and on the other hand, it looks at sort of optimizing workflows. So on the relationship side, what's really interesting is it tells us a lot about the way language is conceptualized and the way also relationships, I guess, are conceptualized. So speaking behaviors, which again are these very embodied kind of things, are being seen as measurable, but also as having very clear social meanings. So it doesn't actually tell us what it means, but we can infer that speaking pace or monologuing tells us something about the performance of the agent. So monologuing is maybe bad. Speaking pace maybe shouldn't be too fast. Those are sort of social judgments that we are to infer. Emotions, similarly, expressed as something that can be accurately sort of measured or derived or mapped onto the voice in order to, again, report on performance and the sort of how well is this conversation going. And then we are framing this as sort of like, oh, this is to support the agent. So this is, for instance, to support agents in the context of having abusive customers and also to sort of provide positive encouragement. This is the sort of thing we saw on the slide before. And then on the other side, we see the use of generative AI specifically to execute better workflows. So this is about compliance. It's about better, like ensuring that people say exactly what they have to say at all times and making this as efficient as possible. And in this way, sort of enriching, as they put it, the entire experience. And then on the back end, the other thing that they do is that they make it very easy for managers to see exactly what's going on in every single interaction. So this is like specific scores. Each of these rows is a person. And you can see, presumably from the red, blue, and green, whether they're doing well. And we can see sort of people are sort of identified, whether they need additional coaching and how they need additional coaching. And again, there is this sort of like notion of, oh, it's all very personalized, but it gives you very good control, sort of total control of all of your workers. And again, this is not the only company that does that. I think this is basically in use across the board now in the industry. And now I want to move on to what people might think of as a much less invasive and much less sort of scary example, but I think one that is also does a similar kind of thing, which is something like Grammarly. So people might be familiar with Grammarly, which is this sort of like spell checking, grammar checking kind of tool that has recently really expanded into these business users and are also really pushed onto students. That's a whole separate side of them, where they're trying to make it easier for companies to have this like clearly identified language policy of like, this is how we communicate, and we can control that everybody is communicating the exact right way. And from a purely like, as a linguist, this is fascinating and nonsensical. But it's also like, it's nonsensical as like on one level, and on another level, it's really fascinating because it's like not nonsensical, obviously, if they put it there. To them, it must mean something. But you have this very strong reification of this idea of like, this is an optimistic tone, an informal tone, a confident tone. And then you have a way of assessing this and making sure that everybody communicates correctly at all times. And you've got this like very literal tone policing. And then you can also see this, again, across your entire company. This is always the flip side of this is always that you can do like a lot of great analytics where you know if everybody is doing the exact kind of, is performing the right kind of affect, basically, which is an interesting next step from we just want to make sure everybody spells things accurately or is legally compliant. And just before I finish up, I'm going to move to my current obsession, which is taking this a step further in this to this idea of agentive AI, which people may have come across. But basically, the current hype around these AI agents, these are systems that are basically LLMs integrated with other kinds of decision-making systems and data sets and additional LLMs and whatever, that are framed as tools that can do a lot more than just an LLM, and that are sort of a lot better informed and more personalized to a particular company. And they're very much framed as these full workers. So Agentforce, which is my particular obsession, they frame this as accessing a limitless workforce. But again, there's a flip side here, which is like, well, what happens to the actual current workers? And one of the things that's quite interesting is that they seem to be promising, oh, don't worry, you're not going to get replaced. You're just going to become a manager of all of these agents. So these are two different companies, but this is the sort of like discourse around it. It's like, oh, this is great because now every single one of your actual human employees has a whole team of experts around them. And they sort of become managers. And I actually don't really know how to best make sense of this, but maybe this is one question we need to think about in going forward is what does it mean when everybody is sort of turned into a manager of like a bot of some sort? And is the long game here, oh, the managers obviously also get removed eventually, or is the long game just like, you're doing your job, but it's a million times more complicated because you have all of these systems that don't work quite well. So I'm going to leave it here and take us back to the more questions and answers. So yeah, this is the ongoing project here. Thank you very much.